I was inspecting my water pump house when I saw 3 cars pulling up my driveway during the worst ice storm Montana had seen in 15 years. The temperature had been hovering around -12 degrees for the past 48 hours, and the entire region was coated in a thick layer of ice that made everything look like a frozen hellscape. Power lines were down across half of Flathead County, and most people were huddled in their homes trying to stay warm. So the fact that anyone was driving in these conditions meant whatever brought them here was either urgent or stupid. I walked out of the pump house, my breath forming thick clouds in the frozen air, and watched as a woman in her mid-40s stepped out of the lead vehicle. She was wearing a fur-lined coat that probably cost more than my truck and had that particular expression on her face that I had come to recognize over the past 2 years. It was the expression of someone who believed the world owed them something. "Can I help you?" I called out, staying near the pump house door. The woman picked her way across the icy ground, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked equally out of place in the rural Montana setting. Behind them, 4 more people emerged from the other vehicles, all dressed like they were heading to a country club rather than trudging through an ice storm. "Mr. Harrison," the woman said, her voice sharp and clipped, "I'm Patricia Drummond, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." I felt my jaw tighten. I knew exactly who Patricia Drummond was. For the past 2 years, she had been a persistent thorn in my side, ever since the housing development called Willow Creek Estates had started construction on the land adjacent to my property. "I know who you are," I said. "What do you want?" Patricia smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your property and the current emergency situation." I crossed my arms, feeling the cold seeping through my jacket. "You drove through an ice storm to discuss my property?" One of the men in suits stepped forward, holding a leather folder. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Douglas Keller, attorney for the Willow Creek Estates HOA. We have a significant problem that affects both your property and our community." "Your community is not my problem," I said flatly. Patricia's smile vanished. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, it is. You see, due to the ice storm, our development has lost water service. The main line from town is frozen and burst in multiple locations. We have 300 homes without water, and the situation is becoming critical." I shrugged. "Like I said, not my problem. Call the county." "We did," Patricia snapped, her composure cracking. "They said it could be a week before they can restore service. We have families with young children, elderly residents, people who need water now." "Then I suggest you start melting ice," I said, turning back toward the pump house. "Mr. Harrison, please." The attorney hurried forward, nearly slipping on the ice. "We are prepared to make you a very generous offer. We know that you have an independent water source on your property. We would like to purchase access to that water for the duration of this emergency." I stopped and turned back to face them. "You want to buy access to my well?" "Yes," Douglas said, looking relieved that I was at least listening. "We would pay you handsomely. Let's say $5,000 for temporary access." I laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You think you can just come up here and buy whatever you want?" Patricia stepped forward again, her face flushing with anger despite the cold. "Mr. Harrison, this is a humanitarian crisis. We have people without water. Surely you can see past whatever petty grudge you have against progress and development." "Petty grudge?" I said, my voice rising. "Your development has tried to cite me for everything from my truck being too old to my fence being the wrong color. You have sent me 17 violation notices in 2 years for a property that is not even part of your HOA. You tried to force me to paint my barn to match your aesthetic guidelines. And now you want me to help you?" "Those notices were sent in error," Douglas said quickly. "Administrative mistakes. We have acknowledged that your property predates the development and is not subject to HOA rules." "After I threatened to sue you," I pointed out, "and only after I spent $3,000 on a lawyer to make you stop." Patricia's expression hardened. "Fine. You want to play hardball. We are prepared to offer $10,000, but that is our final offer." I shook my head. "The answer is no. Now get off my property." "You cannot be serious," Patricia said, her voice going shrill. "You would let people suffer just because of some paperwork issues?" "I would let people who have harassed me for 2 years solve their own problems," I corrected. "You made your choices when you built your little kingdom without proper infrastructure planning. That is on you, not me." The attorney pulled Patricia aside, and they had a hurried, whispered conversation. I could see the other HOA members huddled near the cars, watching nervously. The wind picked up, sending a spray of ice crystals across the frozen landscape. After a moment, Douglas turned back to me. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Let me be direct with you. The HOA has reviewed county records, and we believe there may be some ambiguity about your property boundaries, specifically regarding the land where your well and pump house are located." I went very still. "Excuse me?" Patricia stepped forward, her confidence returning. "What Douglas is saying is that we have evidence suggesting that the land your water source sits on may actually fall within the boundaries of the Willow Creek Estates development, which would make it HOA property." "That is complete garbage," I said, my voice dangerous now. "This land has been in my family for 70 years. My grandfather drilled that well in 1955. Every survey, every deed, every property record confirms this is my land." Douglas opened his leather folder and pulled out several papers. "Actually, there was a boundary dispute in 1987 that was never fully resolved. The creek that runs through this area shifted course during a flood, and the legal descriptions became unclear. We have had a surveyor review the original property markers, and there is a strong case that approximately 2 acres of what you consider your land is actually part of the development tract." 2 acres that just happened to include my well," I said flatly. "How convenient." "Mr. Harrison, we are not trying to steal your land," Patricia said, her tone saccharine now. "We are simply trying to establish the correct legal boundaries, and given the current emergency, we think the responsible thing to do is to exercise our rights to access the water source while we work through the legal details." I stared at her, genuinely amazed at the audacity. "You are trying to annex my land during an ice storm." "We are trying to save lives," Patricia countered, "and if you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action to establish our property rights, during which time we will also seek an emergency injunction to access the water source based on public necessity." One of the other HOA members, a man in an expensive parka, called out, "Patricia, maybe we should just try to find another solution." "Be quiet, Gerald," Patricia snapped. "Mr. Harrison, what is it going to be? Are you going to accept reasonable compensation for water access, or are we going to do this the hard way?" I looked at each of them in turn, these people who had made my life difficult for 2 years, who had tried to force me to comply with rules that did not apply to me, who had questioned every aspect of how I lived on my own land. And now they were threatening to take that land from me. "Get off my property," I said quietly. "Now." Patricia's face went red. "You're making a huge mistake." "The only mistake I made was being polite this long. You have 30 seconds to get in your cars and leave before I call the sheriff." Douglas tried one more time. "Mr. Harrison, please be reasonable." 20 seconds. They stood there for a moment longer, clearly not expecting me to actually refuse. Then Patricia spun on her heel and stalked back to her car, the others following. As they climbed back into their vehicles, she rolled down her window. "This is not over, Mr. Harrison. We will be back with the proper legal authority, and when we are done, you will wish you had taken our offer." I watched them drive away, their expensive SUVs slipping and sliding down my icy driveway. When they were gone, I went back into the pump house and looked at the equipment that had kept my property supplied with clean, abundant water for 7 decades. The well was deep, over 300 feet, and tapped into an aquifer that fed from the mountain snowmelt. The water was pure, cold, and endless. My grandfather had been a genius, placing the well at exactly the right spot, and over the years my father and I had maintained and upgraded the system. We had modern pumps, filtration, everything needed to supply not just my house but potentially much more. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Torres, who had helped me fight off the HOA's previous harassment. It rang 4 times before she picked up. "Marcus, everything okay?" "No," I said, and explained what had just happened. Rachel was quiet for a moment after I finished. "They are bluffing about the property boundary. I reviewed all those records when we dealt with their harassment case. Your property is clearly defined, and there was no unresolved boundary dispute in 1987. They are making it up. Can they actually try to take the land?" "They can file a lawsuit claiming anything they want," Rachel said, "but it would be frivolous and they would lose. The problem is that during an emergency, they might be able to convince a judge to grant temporary access to the water source under some kind of public necessity doctrine. It is a long shot, but with 300 homes without water, a sympathetic judge might go for it. I rubbed my face, feeling the day-old stubble. So what do I do? Sit tight. Do not let them on your property, do not sign anything, and do not make any verbal agreements. If they show up with a court order, call me immediately. In the meantime, I will start preparing a defense in case they actually file something. We talked for a few more minutes, then hung up. I spent the rest of the afternoon winterizing some of my equipment and making sure my own house was secure. The ice storm was supposed to continue for at least another 2 days, and I wanted to be ready. That night, I sat in my living room with a fire crackling in the wood stove, looking out at the frozen landscape. I could see the lights of Willow Creek Estates in the distance, a sprawling development of cookie-cutter houses that had transformed the rural area into suburban sprawl. Before they came, this had been quiet ranchland and family farms. Now, it was street after street of identical houses, with rules about what color you could paint your mailbox and how tall your grass could grow. I had nothing against people wanting to live in a community with rules. That was their choice. But they had chosen to move out here, to the edge of the wilderness, and then tried to force everyone around them to conform to their standards. It was arrogant and entitled, and I was not going to let them bully me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of vehicles on my driveway again. I looked out the window and counted 6 cars this time, including a van with a local news station logo on the side. I pulled on my boots and coat and stepped outside. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, and every breath burned my lungs. Patricia Drummond was there again, along with her attorney and a crowd of people I did not recognize. A man with a camera was filming, and a young woman with a microphone hurried toward me. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Jennifer Walsh with Channel 7 News. Can you comment on the accusations that you are refusing to provide water to families in need during this crisis?" I stared at her. "What?" Patricia pushed forward, positioning herself in front of the camera. "Mr. Harrison has an abundant water source on his property, but is refusing to share it with the 300 families in Willow Creek Estates who are currently without water. We have offered him generous compensation, but he has turned us down, apparently due to a personal vendetta against our community." The reporter turned to me. "Is this true, Mr. Harrison? Are you refusing to help your neighbors?" "They are not my neighbors," I said carefully, "and this is not about refusing to help. This is about a homeowners association that has harassed me for 2 years now, trying to use an emergency to seize land that does not belong to them." "We are not trying to seize anything," Douglas interjected smoothly. "We are simply trying to establish the correct property boundaries and access a water source that may legally belong to the community." "May legally belong," I repeated. "This land has been in my family for 70 years. There's no question about ownership." The reporter looked between us, clearly sensing a story. "So, there is a property dispute?" "No," I said firmly. "There's a homeowners association making false claims to justify taking something that does not belong to them." Patricia turned to the camera, her expression perfectly crafted for sympathy. "We have families with small children who have not had running water for 2 days. We have elderly residents who cannot bathe or flush toilets. And this man, who has more water than he could ever use, refuses to help because of paperwork disputes. I am asking the community to put pressure on Mr. Harrison to do the right thing." "The right thing," I said, my voice rising, "would be for you to stop lying on camera. You are not here asking for help. You showed up yesterday threatening legal action and claiming my land belongs to you. This is not a humanitarian mission. This is a land grab." One of the other HOA members, a woman I did not recognize, stepped forward. "My children have been washing with bottled water. We cannot cook. We cannot clean. How can you just stand there and let this happen?" "How can your HOA board let this happen?" I countered. "You built a development with 300 homes and apparently did not ensure adequate water infrastructure. That is not my fault." The reporter was eating this up, her cameraman capturing every exchange. This was going to be a disaster for me, I realized. Even if I was legally in the right, the court of public opinion was going to see a man refusing to help families in need. "Mr. Harrison," the reporter said, "would you be willing to provide water access if the property dispute was resolved in your favor?" It was a trap question, and I knew it. If I said no, I looked heartless. If I said yes, I was admitting there might be a valid dispute. I will be willing to discuss helping my actual neighbors, I said carefully, once this HOA stops trying to steal my land and starts being honest about what they are doing. Patricia smiled triumphantly. So you admit you are refusing to help? I am refusing to be extorted, I corrected. The interview went on for another 10 minutes, with Patricia and the other HOA members painting me as a heartless hermit hoarding water while families suffered. I tried to explain the situation, but I could tell it was not coming across well. Finally, the news crew left and Patricia and her group drove away, but not before she delivered one more threat. You will regret this, Mr. Harrison. We will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are. After they left, I called Rachel again. I saw 3 calls from different reporters in the past hour, she said before I could speak. What happened? I explained about the news crew and the ambush interview. Rachel sighed. They are trying to pressure you through public opinion. It is a tactic, and honestly, it might work. Even if you are legally right, if the community turns against you, it makes everything harder. So what do? Do not talk to any more reporters without me present, and start documenting everything, every interaction with the HOA, every threat, every attempt to access your property. We might need it. The rest of the day was quiet, but that evening my phone started ringing. The first few calls were from reporters wanting interviews. Then the calls got nastier. People from the development calling to yell at me, to accuse me of being selfish, of endangering children. Some of the calls were threatening. By 8 p.m., I had stopped answering. I sat in my living room, watching the news coverage on my laptop. The story had been picked up by multiple local stations, and the narrative was exactly what I had feared. Selfish landowner refuses to help community in crisis. They showed footage of Patricia talking about children washing with bottled water, of families struggling. Then they showed me, looking angry and defensive, saying my neighbors were not my problem. I looked terrible. I sounded terrible. And worst of all, I could understand why people watching this would think I was terrible. But I also knew that if I gave in now, the HOA would win. They would get access to my water, establish some kind of precedent or claim to the land, and I would never be free of them. This was not about helping people in an emergency. This was about control and power. The next morning, I found a dozen cars parked on the road outside my property. People were holding signs. Water for families. Stop the greed. Help your neighbors. I drove down to the gate at the end of my driveway and found Patricia directing the protesters like a general commanding troops. Mr. Harrison, she called out sweetly, have you reconsidered? This is harassment, I said. This is concerned citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, she countered. They are on public property. There is nothing you can do about it. I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Mike Hernandez, who I had known for years, showed up an hour later. He looked at the protesters, then at me, and shook his head. Marcus, what the hell's going on? I explained the whole situation, the attempted land grab, the threats, the media campaign. Mike listened, then rubbed his face. So the HOA is claiming your well is on their property? They are lying, I said. Check the records. This land is clearly mine. I believe you, Mike said. But Marcus, you have got to understand how this looks. There are 300 families without water, and you are sitting on a well that could help them. They are trying to steal my land, Mike. I know. And legally, you are probably right. But sometimes being right is not enough. He looked at the protesters. This is going to get worse. People are scared and angry, and Patricia Drummond is very good at directing that anger. What do you suggest? Mike was quiet for a moment. If it was me, I would find a way to help that does not give up your rights. Provide water on your terms, with clear legal documentation that it is temporary and does not establish any claim to your property. Get ahead of this before it spirals further. And if they use that access to claim some kind of right to the land, that is why you get it in writing, with lawyers on both sides. Look, I am not saying trust them. I am saying find a way to diffuse this that protects you legally while also stopping this circus. After Mike left, I sat in my truck thinking about what he had said. He was right that this was spiraling. The protests, the media coverage, the phone calls. Even if I won legally, my life was going to be hell. And there were actually families struggling without water, even if their leadership was a nightmare. I called Rachel and floated the idea. And it is risky, she said, but if we structure it right, with a very clear temporary access agreement that explicitly states it creates no property rights or easements, it might work. The key is making sure they cannot use this as a foot in the door. Can you draft something? Yes. But Marcus, you need to understand that even with an ironclad agreement, they might still try to use this against you later. HOAs like this, they do not give up. I know, but I'm not giving up either. Draft the agreement. That afternoon, I called Douglas Keller and told him I was willing to discuss temporary water access under specific conditions. He sounded surprised but agreed to meet. The meeting took place at Rachel's office in Kalispell, a 30-mile drive through icy roads that took nearly 2 hours. Douglas brought Patricia and another HOA board member. Rachel had prepared a 15-page agreement that spelled out in excruciating detail that this was a temporary emergency measure, that it created no property rights, that it acknowledged my sole ownership of the land and water source, and that the HOA would pay for the water at a rate that covered my costs, plus a reasonable fee. Patricia read through it, her face getting redder with each page. This is insulting. You are asking us to pay $3 per gallon of water. That is the cost of delivering water to your development, I said. I have to pump it, treat it, and run a temporary line down to your system, plus the wear on my equipment. The county provides water for 30 cents per 1,000 gallons, Patricia snapped. Then wait for the county to fix their lines, I said. This is a take-it-or-leave-it offer. Douglas put a hand on Patricia's arm. It is still cheaper than trucking and water, and it is immediate. They huddled for a whispered argument, then Patricia turned back to us. Fine, but we want to add a clause about future access if there are other emergencies. No, Rachel said flatly. This is a one-time agreement specific to the current crisis. It expires when the county water service is restored or in 30 days, whichever comes first. And we want the right to inspect the water source to ensure quality, Patricia added. No, I said. You will get the water. You do not get to come on my property beyond the connection point at the property line. We went back and forth for another hour, but eventually they signed. Rachel made sure we had multiple copies, all notarized, and that the agreement was filed with the county that same day. The next morning, I spent 6 hours in the freezing cold running a temporary line from my pump house down to the edge of my property, where it connected to a distribution point the HOA had set up. By that evening, water was flowing into the Willow Creek Estate system. The protesters disappeared. The news coverage shifted to praising the agreement as a community coming together in crisis. Patricia gave an interview where she thanked me for finally doing the right thing, making it sound like she had convinced me rather than acknowledging we had a legal contract. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, the county water service was restored. According to our agreement, my obligation to provide water ended. I disconnected the temporary line and sent a formal notice to the HOA that the emergency access period was over. 3 days after that, I found a work crew on my property, attempting to make the temporary connection permanent. I drove down to the property line where 3 men in coveralls were digging, with a white pickup truck parked nearby. "What are you doing?" I demanded. One of the men looked up. "HOA hired us to winterize the water connection." "That connection is being removed. You are on private property without permission." The man shrugged. "We just do what we're told, buddy. You have a problem. Take it up with the HOA." I called the sheriff's office again. This time, a different deputy showed up, a young guy named Torres who I did not know. "Sir, the workers say they were hired by the homeowners association to perform maintenance on a water system," he said after talking to the crew. "A water system that is being removed from my property," I said, showing him the agreement. "The emergency period is over. They have no right to be here." Deputy Torres read through the contract, looking confused. "This says the access period ended when county service was restored. Was it restored?" "Yes, 2 weeks ago." "Then they should not be here." He turned to the work crew. "You guys need to pack up and leave." The workers shrugged and started loading their tools. As they drove away, one of them called out, "We will be back. The HOA is not done with this." That night, I got a certified letter from Douglas Keller. It claimed that during the emergency access period, the HOA had discovered that the water connection crossed through land that was actually part of the development property, and therefore the connection itself was on HOA land, and they had the right to maintain it. It was absurd. The connection was entirely on my property, well within my boundary lines. But it showed me that they were not giving up. Rachel filed a response and demanded they remove all equipment from my property. They countered with a lawsuit claiming the property boundary was unclear and asking for a survey to be done by a court-appointed surveyor. It was exactly what they had threatened during the ice storm, and now they were following through. The lawsuit dragged on for 3 months. During that time, the HOA made my life miserable in every petty way they could. They filed complaints with the county about my property, claiming code violations that did not exist. They sent letters to my few remaining neighbors, suggesting I was stealing water from the aquifer that fed the region. They even started a rumor that my well was contaminating groundwater, forcing the county to come out and test, which of course showed nothing wrong. Patricia Drummond seemed to take personal pleasure in the harassment. I would see her sometimes, driving past my property, always with that smug smile. But while they were playing their games, I was doing research, and what I found changed everything. It started when I was reviewing the original development plans for Willow Creek Estates, trying to understand their water system. I noticed something odd. The development was supposed to have 2 water sources, the main line from town and a backup well system that was never built. I dug deeper, requesting documents from the county planning office. What I found was that the HOA had cut corners during construction. They were supposed to drill backup wells as part of the development approval, but they had skipped that step to save money, gambling that the single connection to the town system would be enough, which meant they had built the development without proper emergency water infrastructure, violating their own approved plan. But that was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what I found when I traced the water rights for the area. In Montana, water rights are complicated. Surface water and groundwater are governed by different rules, and rights are based on historical use and filing claims with the state. I pulled the water rights records for my property and for the land that became Willow Creek Estates. My family had filed water rights claims for our well in 1955, and those rights had been continuously maintained. We had senior rights to draw from the aquifer. Willow Creek Estates had filed water rights claims when they started development, but those were junior rights, subordinate to existing claims. More importantly, when I looked at the aquifer maps and hydrogeology reports, I realized something crucial. The aquifer that fed my well was the same aquifer that the entire region depended on. The town's water system, which Willow Creek Estates connected to, drew from this aquifer through a well field 5 miles away. And because of the geology of the area, my well was upstream in terms of groundwater flow, which meant that if I ever exercised my senior water rights to their full extent, I could potentially affect the water available downstream, including to the town's well field. I was not planning to do that. It would be a disaster for everyone. But the fact that I had those rights, that my claim was senior to everyone else's, gave me leverage I had not realized I had. I called Rachel and explained what I had found. "Marcus, this is huge," she said. "If you have senior rights to the aquifer, and if the town's wells are downstream in the groundwater flow, you essentially have control over the region's water supply." "I do not want to control the water supply," I said. "I just want to keep my land." "I understand, but this gives us negotiating power. The HOA has been acting like they hold all the cards, but if they push you too far, you could make things very difficult for everyone, including the town that supplies their water." "Is that even legal? I mean, could I actually restrict the water?" Under Montana water law, senior rights holders have priority during shortages. If you claimed you needed to draw more water for irrigation, livestock, or other beneficial uses on your property, you could potentially force junior rights holders to reduce their usage. It would be ugly, there would be legal fights, but your rights are solid. I thought about this for a long time. Then I had an idea. The next HOA board meeting was public, held at a community center in the development. I showed up unannounced, walked in, and asked to speak during the public comment period. Patricia looked like she had swallowed a lemon when she saw me, but she could not refuse without violating their own bylaws. "Mr. Harrison," she said icily, "what brings you here?" I walked to the front of the room, facing the board and the 30 or so residents who had shown up. I wanted to address the ongoing property dispute and provide some information that I think the community should know. Douglas Keller stood up. "Mr. Harrison, that matter is in litigation. It would be inappropriate to discuss it here." "I'm not discussing the lawsuit," I said. "I am discussing water rights." I pulled out copies of the water rights documents and the aquifer maps. For those who do not know, Montana water law operates on a priority system. Senior rights holders, those who claimed water first, have priority over junior rights holders. My family filed water rights claims for our well in 1955. I handed out the documents to the board members. Willow Creek Estates filed their water rights claims in 2023, making them junior to my claim. More importantly, the aquifer that feeds my well is the same aquifer that feeds the town's water system, which your development relies on. Patricia snatched the documents from my hand. "What is your point?" "My point is that I have senior rights to water from an aquifer that this entire region depends on. And while I have no intention of exercising those rights to their full extent, the fact is that, legally, I could." The room went quiet. One of the residents, an older man, raised his hand. "What does that mean, exercising your rights to the full extent?" "It means," I said carefully, "that if there was ever a shortage, or if I claimed I needed more water for my property, Montana law would require junior rights holders to reduce their usage to ensure I get my full allocation. Given the geology of this aquifer, that could potentially affect the town's wells, which feed this development." Douglas was flipping through the documents, his face going pale. "This is a scare tactic." "No," I said. "This is me pointing out that the HOA has been acting like I'm some powerless landowner you can bully into giving up my property. But the reality is that I hold the senior water rights to the aquifer that keeps your development running. Now, I've been very careful not to overuse that water. I've been a responsible steward of the resource. But if you keep pushing me, if you keep trying to steal my land, I will start exploring what my full legal rights are." Patricia stood up, her face red. "You are threatening to cut off our water supply?" "I am saying that you should think very carefully about continuing this harassment. You built a development without proper backup water systems, violating your own approved plans. You have been trying to seize my property to cover up that mistake. And now you are discovering that I have more leverage than you thought." Another resident stood up, a woman who looked worried. "But you could not actually stop the town's water system, could you? That would affect thousands of people." "I do not want to affect anyone," I said honestly. "I just want to live on my land in peace. But if the HOA forces me to defend my property rights to the fullest extent, that is going to include defending my water rights, and those rights are very, very strong." The meeting erupted into chaos. Residents were shouting questions at the board, demanding to know why they had not been told about the water rights situation, why the backup wells were never built. Patricia tried to regain control, but it was clear the board had lost the room. I left while they were still arguing. 2 days later, Douglas Keller called Rachel requesting a meeting. We met again at her office, and this time, Douglas came alone. "Mr. Harrison," he said, looking tired, "the HOA board would like to discuss a settlement." "I am listening," I said. "We will drop the property boundary lawsuit and acknowledge your full ownership of your land, including the area where the well and pump house are located. We will also agree to cease all code enforcement actions and complaints against your property. In exchange, we ask that you agree not to exercise your water rights in any way that would affect the town's water supply." I looked at Rachel, who shook her head slightly. "Not good enough," I said. Douglas sighed. "What do you want?" "First, the HOA will issue a public apology for the harassment and the false claims about my property. Second, the HOA will reimburse me for all legal fees I have incurred fighting your actions, which currently total about $18,000. Third, the HOA will pay for a professional survey of my property line to be done by a surveyor of my choosing, and you will file that survey with the county to end any future boundary questions. Fourth, Patricia Drummond will resign from the HOA board." Douglas blinked. "Patricia will never agree to resign." Then we do not have a deal. She has been the driving force behind this harassment, and as long as she is in power, I do not trust that the HOA will leave me alone. The board cannot force her to resign. The residents can vote her out, I said, and given what they just learned about the water situation and the missing backup wells, I think they might be motivated to do that. In fact, I think there might be some questions about how the development funds were spent, given that backup wells were supposed to be built but never were. Douglas went even paler. Are you suggesting there was financial mismanagement? I am suggesting that the residents might want an audit, but that is not my concern. My concern is that Patricia Drummond resigns from the board as part of this settlement. If she does not, then there is no deal, and I will start exercising my water rights. Rachel jumped in. My client is willing to be reasonable, but he needs assurances that this harassment will end. Ms. Drummond has made this personal, and her removal from the board is a necessary condition. Douglas left to consult with the board. 3 days later, he called back. The board had agreed to all the terms except Patricia's resignation. However, they had convinced her to agree not to run for re-election when her term ended in 4 months, and to recuse herself from any matters involving my property in the meantime. It was not perfect, but it was something. Rachel and I negotiated a few more details, and 2 weeks later, we signed the settlement agreement. The HOA issued a public apology, acknowledging that they had been mistaken about the property boundaries and regretting any inconvenience caused to me. They wrote me a check for $18,000. They paid for a new professional survey that confirmed every inch of my property line. And Patricia Drummond, while she stayed on the board, stopped appearing at meetings and stopped leading any actions against me. I thought that was the end of it. Again, I was wrong. 6 weeks after the settlement, I was working in my barn when I heard vehicles on my driveway. I looked out and saw 3 Sheriff's Department SUVs pulling up, lights flashing. Mike Hernandez got out, along with 2 other deputies I did not know well. He looked grim. "Marcus, we need to talk." My heart sank. "What happened?" "We have a warrant to search your property, specifically your well and pump house." I stared at him. "What? Why?" One of the other deputies, a stone-faced woman named Kim Alvarez, stepped forward. "We received a complaint that you have been illegally dumping chemicals near your well, which may be contaminating the groundwater." "That is insane. Who filed the complaint?" "The complaint was anonymous, but it came with some very specific details and photographs. We have to follow up." They showed me the warrant, which was legitimate. I called Rachel, who said to cooperate, but document everything. I followed the deputies around as they inspected my pump house, took water samples, and photographed everything. The specific details in the complaint were complete fabrications. Someone had apparently taken photos of some old fertilizer bags in my barn and claimed I was dumping chemicals by the well. In reality, those bags were for my garden and were stored 50 yards away from the well in a proper containment area. The inspection took 4 hours. When they finally left, Mike pulled me aside. "Marcus, I'm sorry about this. For what it is worth, I do not think there is anything here. But we had to check." "Who filed the complaint, Mike?" "It was anonymous, but it came through a lawyer's office, Douglas Keller's office." I felt my anger spike. "The HOA did this." "I cannot prove that, but yeah, probably." He looked uncomfortable. "Look, the water tests will come back clean, and this will go away. But watch your back. Someone is not done with you." The water tests did come back clean, of course, but 2 weeks later I got another visit, this time from the County Code Enforcement Office, claiming I was operating an unpermitted water utility. Then, the State Environmental Agency showed up asking about water extraction permits. Then, the IRS sent a letter questioning whether I had reported income from the temporary water access during the ice storm. Every single complaint and inquiry was either frivolous or easily resolved, but each one took time, money, and stress. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and it was clearly coordinated. I called Rachel. "They are violating the settlement agreement. The harassment was supposed to stop." "The settlement said the HOA would stop taking actions against you. These complaints are coming from anonymous sources or government agencies. We would have to prove the HOA is behind them, and they are being very careful not to leave fingerprints. So what do? Document everything, and be very, very careful. Someone is trying to provoke you into doing something they can use against you." She was right. This was a war of attrition, trying to exhaust me until I either gave up or made a mistake. But two could play that game. I started filing public records requests, asking for documents about Willow Creek Estates development. I requested building permits, financial records, board meeting minutes, everything that was supposed to be public. And I found discrepancies. The backup wells that were supposed to be built were budgeted in the development plan at $200,000. But there was no record of that money being spent. The board minutes showed that Patricia Drummond had convinced the board to defer the wells to optimize cash flow, but there was no record of where that money went. I also found that several board members, including Patricia, had relatives who owned the companies that got contracts for development work. Landscaping, snow removal, maintenance, all at rates that seemed very high. It looked like embezzlement, or at the very least, serious financial mismanagement and conflicts of interest. I compiled everything into a detailed report and sent it to the HOA's membership, along with a letter explaining that while I had no personal interest in the HOA's internal affairs, I thought the residents deserved to know how their money was being spent. The response was explosive. Within a week, a group of residents had formed a committee to investigate the board. They hired a forensic accountant and discovered that over $300,000 was unaccounted for over the past 3 years. Patricia Drummond and 2 other board members were forced to resign. The HOA filed a lawsuit against them for breach of fiduciary duty. And best of all for me, the new board leadership reached out to apologize for the harassment and to assure me that it would stop. And it did. The anonymous complaints ceased. The government inquiries closed with no findings. The new HOA board even sent a formal letter to the county stating that they had no property disputes with me and asking that any future complaints be verified before action was taken. Patricia tried to fight back, hiring her own lawyers and claiming she'd been scapegoated. But the evidence was damning, and eventually she settled with the HOA, agreeing to repay some of the missing money and to drop any claims against the association. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband moved away 6 months later, selling their house at a loss and leaving Montana entirely. The criminal investigation took longer. The county prosecutor reviewed the case and ultimately decided that while there was clear financial mismanagement, proving criminal embezzlement would be difficult because some of the expenditures could be argued as legitimate business decisions, even if they were terrible ones. However, the state attorney general's office took an interest in the conflicts of interest involving Patricia, awarding contracts to companies owned by her relatives. That crossed the line from poor management to fraud. 14 months after the ice storm, Patricia Drummond was arrested and charged with 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of theft. Her husband, who owned one of the companies that received contracts, was charged as well. I attended the arraignment, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Patricia saw me and her face went white. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was being unfairly targeted, that this was a civil matter, not criminal. The judge was not impressed, especially when the prosecutor presented evidence that Patricia had falsified invoices and created shell companies to hide the payments. She was released on bail, but the trial was set for the following year. 8 months later, rather than go to trial, Patricia and her husband took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of theft. Her husband pleaded to 1 count of fraud. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison with credit for time served and the possibility of early release for good behavior. Her husband got probation and community service. The HOA recovered about $150,000 through the criminal restitution and the civil settlement. The new board used some of that money to finally drill the backup wells that should have been built in the first place. As for me, life got quiet again. The new HOA board left me alone. They even invited me to a community barbecue, which I politely declined, but appreciated the gesture. My property was clearly mine, with no disputes or clouds on the title. My water rights were undisputed and documented. I still live on my land. The same land my grandfather bought in 1948, the same land my father worked, the same land I intend to pass on someday. The well he drilled in 1955 still pumps clean, cold water from deep in the earth, as much as I could ever need. And every time I walk past the pump house, I think about that day during the ice storm when Patricia Drummond and her entourage drove up my driveway, trying to bully me into giving them what they wanted. They thought I was just some isolated landowner they could push around. They never imagined that the water they needed so badly was completely under my control, protected by rights older than their development, older than their HOA, older than most of the people in the valley. They learned the hard way that out here, water is power. And I held the power all along. The irony is that I would have helped them if they had just asked respectfully, if they had treated me like a neighbor instead of an obstacle. But they chose intimidation and lies and legal threats. They chose to make an enemy out of someone who just wanted to be left alone. In the end, their greed and arrogance destroyed them. Patricia Drummond went from being the queen of Willow Creek Estates to a convicted felon. The HOA went from trying to expand their territory to fighting for survival. And I went back to living my life in peace. Sometimes, on clear winter nights, I can see the lights of the development in the distance. There are good people living there now, families who had nothing to do with Patricia's schemes. The new HOA board is trying to do right by them, maintaining the community without the corruption and petty tyranny. I do not have anything against them. I hope they thrive and that their children grow up happy in those cookie-cutter houses with their manicured lawns and their strict rules about mailbox colors. But I also hope they remember the story of what happened when their HOA tried to take something that was not theirs. I hope they remember that sometimes the quiet guy on the neighboring property, the one who just wants to be left alone, might be the one holding all the cards. Because out here in Montana, water is life, and I control the water.